You pay attention, with so much at stake.
Seas are rising and chronic flooding will be the new normal.
You navigate, you listen, you keep an ear out. You pay attention, and so do we. We tell the stories of our time every day.
In the 26th day of testimony and on the 139th witness, Shahar Tsarnaev wept.
We unearth what would otherwise stay hidden.
There's just a lot of hate in this world, and that day, for that hour, we were humans.
Across the street.
The Red Sox have won the World Series.
And around the globe.
It's here and now.
This is Modern Love.
This is WBUR's All Things Considered.
This is only a game.
This is On Point.
This is Radio Boston.
On air, online, on demand, and on stage in the heart of Boston.
I'm Jack Lepiars. Welcome to WBUR City Space.
Always looking forward, paying attention, and knowing that your story is one of our stories.
Good morning. I'm Bob Oates.
I'm Lisa Mullins.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarti.
I'm Jeremy Hobson.
This is 90.9 WBUR Boston.
I want you to know that in the green room, Frans was teasing me about my scatological humor, but I didn't show you pictures of piles of
fishes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A while ago, by the way, I was talking to Jane Goodall off camera several years ago, and I said, have you noticed that everything seems to be for bonobos now, not so much chimps? And she said, yes, and all because chimps don't rub their bottoms together like that. Hello, everyone. Thank you for that. I'm going to plunge right in because I have lots of questions, and I know that you all must also. And we discussed in your book, the average person fears public speaking more than death. And the audience of speakers end up sharing stress hormones, like voles who are bonded. So how do you feel right now?
I feel very relaxed.
Good for you. So the premise of this, I've reviewed this book, and as you know, I think it's his best book yet. And the question is, do humans and animals, non-human animals, share emotion? And you say that you don't look at our own species emotionally much different from other mammals. And in fact, you would be hard-pressed to pinpoint uniquely human emotions, and that we had better pay careful attention to the emotional background we share with our fellow travelers on this planet. How many of you, I wonder, agree with Frans?
All non-scientists.
There are probably some scientists. One of the main reasons I think the book is so successful, and a huge part of its appeal, is that it's funny, and you all got a taste of that, and heartbreaking. It takes biased old school science to task, but the tone is not scornful, playfully combative maybe in some places. And as you rip apart notions of human exceptionalism with lines like, you tell me what consciousness is, and I'll tell you if elephants have it. That usually shuts them up, is what you said. In comparisons between us and other animals, it's often the animals who come out better than we do. And one of your examples is that we lack expressive ears, you say, which is a serious handicap.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another thing. If people say that humans must have more expressive faces, what horses do with their ears, or cats or dogs, that's very expressive.
We can read it, I think that generally we do. Yet we human beings constantly try to find or build boundaries between us and other animals. We say, instead of laughing, laugh-like behavior or vocalized panting. And we have an unease when we do see our behavior in non-human animals. Right off the bat in the book, this is the scatological stuff. You talk about rival chimps reconciling by inspecting each other's butts. And you challenge the reader, who may feel queasy about it, that you're sure there's a good reason that in the English language, we have expressions like brown-nosing, ass-kissing, And that it's actually, time and again, you tie our own behavior to that of other animals. I'm curious about, you obviously have studied chimps and bonobos and have written about them, but you're bringing in lots of other animals, zebrafish, dogs, voles. Wondering if any of that was a surprise to you, all of the species that you ended up.
No. I've always been trained to look at all the animals, and so I sort of accidentally ended up in primatology, but I worked before with birds also. I've worked with rats. I think rats are very complex animals.
You had a pet bird
I had pet birds also, yeah.
The complexity of something as simple as a smile, which we got some of here, and it seems simple, a smile, and yet there are fear grins and fake smiles, and the grins of, you mentioned the book, we've all seen performing chimps in film and on stage, and that in particular is bothersome to you, that you recognize.
Because it's a fearful expression, and it's usually a trainer who stands there with a zapper, a cattle zapper, and that intimidates them, and then they have that expression. Yeah.
And we see some of that with, also in the book you mentioned that children, sometimes when they're reprimanded, can't stop smiling.
The smile, yeah.
And this is submission or?
Yeah, the submissive smile or an appeasement smile. There was one study done on fighters, on professional fighters, and they took pictures before the fight of them. And the one who smiled in the picture was the one who usually lost. And they said he smiled probably because he already felt nervous about the whole thing.
And in gender, we talked a little bit about gender differences too, and that most men don't have the experience that people walk, but women walking down the street may have men, strangers passing them by saying, smile. So there's some power brokering. What does Botox do? I think both to the, how the human with the Botox is perceived with empathy?
So in our daily interaction, we have an enormous amount of facial mimicry that goes on. And there are small movements in the face that you barely notice. So if I talk with someone who's laughing, I will be laughing, or talking with someone who's sad, I will have a sad expression. So there's a lot of mimicry going on. And that feeds back into my own emotions. So by taking on a sad face, I will also start to feel sad. That's called the echo of your facial expressions. And so if you take Botox, you remove that flexibility of the face. And so on the one hand, you cannot relate to others as well. So you become less empathic. And that has been demonstrated actually in experiments. You become less empathic towards others because you cannot mimic their face. But the other way around also, the other feels shut off because you are not showing the mimicry that they expect normally. Normally you expect someone, if you tell them a sad story, to have a sad expression. If that face is frozen, you feel sort of shut off from that person. So Botox may make you look beautiful, but it's actually not a very good thing to do.
And smiling is separate from laughing. Our heritage through our biology and our evolution, those are not the
They're
same.
separate expressions, yeah. And laughing is, of course, one of the most animalistic expressions we have. I once attended a lecture by a philosopher, a man who was saying that he sort of was too animalistic laughing. Because when we laugh, we pee in our pants, we lose control, you lose your breath, you turn red. So it's a very animalistic display. And he said, why don't we just say that was funny? and you're all doing the vocalized panting now here. But that's what he said, yeah.
That is, so you talk a lot about the contagious factor of laughter and that it's social bonding and that its effect on us. I have found that no matter how many times, there's no joke in what I'm about to read, but I can't not laugh. And it's also, you mentioned Mary Tyler Moore, but you talk about your family growing up and seeing them, and you say laughter is far more typical of affectionate relations between buddies, lovers, spouses, parents, and children. Where would marriages be without the glue of humor? I'm from a big family. That's Frans, not me. And remember with fondness the laughter around the dinner table, which could get so intense that I felt like dying. I'd have to exit the room to catch my breath and regain composure. The earliest laughter in our lives always occurs in a nurturing context. And that there you talk about a gorilla mother tickling, but the notion, just reading about you laughing that hard that you had to leave the room always starts me giggling again, and there's no actual...
I wrote that partly because there are theories like Thomas Hobbes, who was not a very friendly person, I think. Hobbes, but also Dick Alexander, a biologist, they had these papers about laughter where they depicted laughter as a hostile act. So laughter is done to laugh at, like racism, or racist joke would be one of these hostile acts that you can have. So they describe laughter as a hostile behavior. And the first laughter you see in a baby chimp is when mom tickles it with a big finger, and that's a very nurturing context. So I don't know what these men were thinking about humor, you know?
And laughing also releases endorphin. I mean, are we bonding as we're all...
Yeah, I think it releases endorphins, yeah.
And you also had described the critic John Lahr, who talked about an audience laughing as bodies collapse, not in agony, but in rapture. And human is not central to laughter. Social relationships are. I think again and again, throughout this book, on every page, there's not only incredible stories of our fellow creatures, but insights into, obviously, the continuum, our own behavior, the thought that it's like wolves howling in a pack, that it's a bonding experience.
Yeah, laughter is, I think, very important social glue. And laughter is also used to take the sting out of something, so I can still give you the truth, but if we laugh about it, it's still okay.
All right. The flip side of social bonding is loss. And here, I feel a little obsessed with the voles. The prairie voles, unlike promiscuous meadow voles, maintain exclusive bonds with mates. The reward center of their brains is rich in receptors for oxytocin, a neuropeptide that fosters bonding, not just in voles, but in all mammals, including us. And when one of those faithful little voles loses a mate, you say these tiny rodents seem to know grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they have the cortisol response, the elevated stress hormones. So very similar to human grief, very similar to, let's say, an orca who grieves. So the recent case of the orca who carried her calf around for 17 days. So yeah, in the voles, they demonstrated, because they do a lot of neuroscience on these rodents, they demonstrated that the phenomena seem very similar to human grief. Of course, for the behavior of, let's say, elephants or orcas or so, we don't do the neuroscience, so we have just the behavior. In this case, you have the neuroscience on top of it.
This is one of the things that the book, you are distinguishing between emotions and feelings. Yeah. And I don't know that, do most of you like automatically know what the distinction would be between an emotion and a feeling? Good. Good audience. You mentioned it in several places, and I think the thing that emotions are bodily expressed, hence observable. I'm going to ask and answer my question with what you said, no. Whereas feelings remain private, and you say that something like reconciliation is observable, but forgiveness is internal.
Yeah, so feelings are the states that you experience. You may not experience all your emotions, but when emotions bubble to the consciousness so that you can experience them, then you can talk about them. Feelings is something we talk about. Emotions is something you can see in the body, in the expression, in the voice. If you talk with someone on the phone, you know what kind of mood they are. That's the voice and that's the body, basically, that is being communicated. That's why a telephone call is much better than an email message, for example, to get the emotion of somebody. So yes, the emotions are expressed in the body. The reason I need to keep emotions and feelings separate is because the big argument against studying animal emotions has always been, you don't know what they feel. You don't know what your dog feels. Which is true, but I think it's equally true for humans. I don't know what you feel. You can tell me you are a happy person and you're happy today, and I don't know if your happiness is the same as my happiness. You can talk about it with me, but all the research now on emotions in humans is done on the basis of feelings, because all these psychologists, they ask you to fill out questionnaires and they ask, how did you feel here and how did you feel there? So we're all talking about feelings and not the emotions as they are expressed in the body, which you can also measure. They're very easily measurable in terms of heart rate and blood pressure and temperature and so on. So the emotions are expressed in the body and are perfectly measurable. There's nothing wrong with measuring emotions in animals. But if you ask me, how does the dog feel? I don't know. I can guess. I have a very good guess, especially with primates, because the bodies and their expressions are so similar. So I can guess at it, but I cannot know it really.
And you make the point also with fellow human beings, the same would be, you have maybe a better sense of it than...
Yeah, but humans describe their feelings, but humans lie so much. That's a problem. Is that they will say they're happy and a month later they're divorced. And then I need to wonder, why didn't I pick up on that? And the picking up part would have been the body. I should have seen the clues.
I'm curious about what are you constantly, and I've seen you in other interviews too, and you're very, you seem very even-tempered. It's not necessarily easy to read your expression, but I wonder if constantly, and this gives you an advantage in life.
It gives me an advantage. No, I'm a Dutchman, you know. We don't express emotions. We're almost like in these Bergman movies where they insult each other and they think about it for half an hour before they give an answer. It's a bit... So yeah, we don't express emotions so well.
My first interview ever with Jane Goodall, as a young journalist, we were always told that if someone isn't fully answering a question, you just don't say anything. Look at them, and they'll fill in the uncomfortable silence. So I tried that on Jane Goodall, the famous primatologist who studied chimpanzees, and this is what we did for 5 minutes. She was not in the least bit uncomfortable with silently looking into the face of another primate.
Now, the only time Dutch people express emotions, Dutch men, because we always say that women are more emotional than men, but I don't believe a word of it, because if the Dutch soccer team plays against another team, that's where you see such a wide range of expressions and emotions.
Among the things that intrigue me in the book are some of the sort of cones. You have these little fortunes about how we might view our place in the world or our own behavior. Power and rank are different things. How is it that we think of power and rank as going together? And I think that you talked in the...
Yeah, so rank... You can have a high-ranking male, as the story I told you of the alpha male, young alpha male who was not very well accepted. He was very high in rank, he dominated the other males, but still the group as a whole was not very happy with him because he was not even-handed in how he broke up conflicts. And so if he chose party, they would go after him. A real alpha male usually stand above the parties and is sort of, how do you say, impartial when he breaks up fights, but he was not. So yes, he had a high rank, but Mama was much more powerful in the group than he was, the young male. So yeah, I always make that distinction. Power has to do with how much influence you have on group processes, which is really hard to measure, but after a while you get some sort of idea of it. Whereas rank is just A dominates B and B dominates C and so on. That's very simple.
And the whole concept of alphas, which you sort of, I think, injected into our society a while ago, is mistaken. What the definition of an alpha is, what power is about exerting control or restoring harmony. That's in a little political section.
Yeah, so alpha male, I use it in my book Chimpanzee Politics. And it became very popular after that. And now, since that time, everyone in Washington wants to be an alpha male. And so alpha male is, I think, abused. If you go on Amazon.com and you type in alpha male, you get all these business books on how to be an alpha male. And they're all about beating up your opponents and letting them know every day that you're a boss and that's the alpha male. And so it's basically a bully that is described. And I have known bullies in chimpanzees. They do occur on occasion. But most of the alpha males that I know are real leaders in the sense that they break up fights, they keep the peace, they're the consoler in chief, Everyone looks at the alpha male to see how issues are going to be resolved. And if you have a really effective alpha male, you get a very peaceful society because he keeps the peace there and he unifies the group. And so that kind of alpha males do exist. They become very popular in the group because everyone then supports them in the sense that if they're ever challenged by a younger male, the whole group thinks, well, this one is better, they're going to keep this one and they're going to support them. Whereas if you have a bully, the reign of bullies is usually short because as soon as there's a viable challenger, they're going to put their weight behind the challenger and get rid of the bully. And sometimes they end very badly. In wild groups, there are males who get killed in captivity. We usually take them out before that happens, but yeah, they end very badly often.
You've described in the book a male that you saw attacked that affected you for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was an incident that happened at that particular zoo in Arnhem where a male, all of a sudden he had become alpha male because the coalition that was dominating him broke up. So these two males who were dominating him, they got a big falling out. As a result, they lost their power and he became alpha male. And they were very upset. These other two males were very upset that this happened, and at some point they killed him at night. They killed him in one of the night cages. And for me, this was a very sad moment because I was very attached to that male. And I saw him in the morning because he died of blood loss, but I saw him still alive. And so I was very affected by it. And I kept dreaming about it and everything. And this was right before I moved to the US. And so I was thinking at the time about what am I going to do? What kind of career do I want in the US? And what kind of studies am I going to do? And I was very affected by that case. And I thought, well, I need to keep studying reconciliation behavior because I had discovered that primates reconciled after fights. And some of my colleagues had told me that this was not a particularly interesting thing because the interesting thing was competition and who wins and who loses and stuff like that. And I thought, well, no, if they don't reconcile and they don't resolve their conflicts, then they lose their lives. Then you get this kind of incidents. And so it's actually a very important mechanism. And so I got interested in reconciliation and I decided to focus on that. And that's what I did when I came to the US. I started focusing on reconciliation behavior.
How do you prevent yourself from being so attached to a specific animal that you're studying, to see clearly your own observations among them?
Yeah, that's for the primatologist. That's always the struggle. Is we get involved and engaged, but we're also supposed to keep our distance. And the way we handle that is usually by having a very strict methodology. So we have rules of how you collect the data, and we describe. So you're not just sitting there and have some sort of impression of the behavior. No, you tabulate. For example, if I were to state females groom more than males, that has to be based on data that we actually collect. And then I can say females spend 5% of their time grooming and males 3% or something, whatever the measure is. So we have rules of how you collect the data. And that allows you to, even if you have certain individuals that you like more and others that you like less, that kind of preferences doesn't interfere with the data collection.
I'm also curious about, you've obviously observed animals both in the wild and in captivity. Among my friends who work in the zoo community, they'll always say that if the chimps are out on exhibit and there's a VIP who comes into the zoo that day, the chimps will immediately spot that and react accordingly, whether it's, I'm curious, and so what do you see is it the body language of the mayor of the city who's come in? Is it the way?
Well, if the mayor of the city comes in, this guy will walk in there and there will be all these underlings who look up at him. And so
I wanted you to do that.
It's usually very easy to spot. My chimps, you know what they hate the most? They hate women with a lot of makeup and a lot of rings and bells on them and high heels and stuff like that. They really react to that very negatively. And they react to powerful men. Sometimes they want to intimidate them. I still remember one interesting case was really wonderful, was very sad for that. Was one of the chief editors of the Harvard University Press, who came to visit me in the time that I wrote a book for them. He came to visit me, and I said, well, dress casually because it's a field station, but he came with fancy shoes and tie and everything. And I walked up to the chimps with my assistant on the other side. My assistant was here, the guy was in the middle, and I was here. And the chimps have very good aim with their feces, you know. So the three of us walk up there, and he was covered, and we were completely clean. This was I should have been more careful, but they do these things. Yeah.
Was he a good sport about it, or?
Yeah, I think he took it in stride. At least he had a story to tell when he would come home. Yeah.
Do you have any insight into why the glamorous, that's my term, women would cause that reaction?
I think they see it as arrogant. People who are dressed like that, they will see that as they set themselves apart. They often also don't look at the chimps as individuals. They look at them as if they see a bunch of rabbits or something. The chimps want to be seen as individuals, just as you want to be seen as an individual.
Fascinating. All right. Don't tell me stuff that I don't already know in here, because then it's just mull it over. I would like to know, I am often, particularly in books, writing about an unusual, strong connection between a person and an animal or a species, and how that changed the person's life. How do you think, aside from what you studied, but how is it, do you think you're a better man, a better human from your interactions and studying and what you've seen among primates in particular?
I'm not sure. I've always liked animals. I've always been attracted to animals. And so for me, there's not a moment in time where I started spending more time with animals. There was one moment in time where I was a student starting out in biology, where I really hated biology because all they did was give me dead animals to cut open and then make drawings of their interiors. And that was not and it was all formaldehyde, you know, it was very smelly business. So I didn't like that phase at all, and then I moved to another university to study behavior. But I've always done that, and I'm not sure that it has changed me. I'm by nature an observer, so I always like to watch things. And that's what I do as a profession.
And as you talk about empathy and fairness, economic fairness is any other kind of fairness, and you observe it in the animals you've seen. Has it shifted in any way your notion of what we would consider noble or?
Yeah, it has certainly. The fairness studies that we did, I don't know if people know this experiment that we did on Capuchin monkeys with grapes and cucumber, where the one who gets the cucumber is very unhappy about the deal. This was something we discovered by accident, and I must say I was not ready. We were not seeking to study the origins of fairness. And I was not ready at that point to think that fairness, which you look at as a moral principle, can be found in primates. And I still remember a philosopher writing us an angry letter saying it's impossible that monkeys have a sense of fairness because fairness was discovered during the French Revolution. And for me, that's exactly the wrong way of looking at morality, because many philosophers, they look at morality as some sort of principles we arrive at through reasoning and logic. And so the logic is, of course, that it is good for society to have fairness going on and things like that. But I think it comes out of emotions. And basically what the monkey study showed is that very basic emotion of envy. One monkey was envious of the other. And I think that's the basis, actually, of our sense of fairness. Our sense of fairness is to avoid envious reactions.
And does it go in the opposite direction? Are there animals who think, I got too much? I'm going to give you some of
In chimpanzees, that happens, not in the monkeys. In the monkeys and the dogs and the young children, they all have just the envy response. But in chimpanzees, they will refuse the grape till the other one also gets a grape. So it gets us very close to the human sense. Yeah.
And often I think there have been studies in which one chimp may not know, one chimp may know where food is hidden, but need the help of another who is then brought in ignorant of the fact, but and has to reveal it in that.
Yeah. That's the traditional Menzel experiment. It's called. Emil Menzel developed that. He would show a low-ranking chimp where food was hidden in a field, and he would sometimes give them a small pile of food and a big pile of food, and he would show where it was hidden. And this low-ranking chimp would then take the rest of the group, but would be very careful because the high-ranking ones would, of course, steal the food and claim all the food. And so what the low-ranking ones started to do at some point is lead the whole group to the small pile and then rush off to the big pile. So misleading information.
And is there fairness in how chimpanzees and other animals are tested in this way about their emotion? And have you seen those kinds of studies change over time yourself?
You mean how we test them?
Is it, yes. We laugh sometimes about, obviously they're not being starved before.
No, we never do that. We give them stuff that they normally don't get or more of the same. We also don't give them M&Ms or something like that, which they really like marshmallows and M&Ms. So no, we try to keep them healthy. But yeah, in many studies of animal cognition, it used to be very common in the behaviorists. They would starve their animals. They would keep their rats at 80% of their weight to do tests on them, which I always find so strange, because why don't we do that at the universities? Why don't we keep all these students at 80% of their weight? And would they learn more and better? I doubt it, you know? But that's the thinking there. Yeah.
I am going to... I can't see anyone or anything, but nonetheless, I'm going to see if there are audience questions.
Oh, these are the questions, I see. And then people need to vote on the questions?
We're on what kind of game show would that be? You mentioned that Anonymous wants to know.
Okay.
What is that sweater? You mentioned that primates display emotions that some think of as uniquely human. Are there any emotions that you see in primates that you do not see in humans?
Oh. Well, there have been speculations that some of the cetaceans, for example, that they have more affiliation and more affection.
Dolphins, cetaceans.
Yeah, that they're more attached to each other than we are. Because you get these strandings of groups of whales and things like that to explain that, and also based on the brain structure, that they have actually more attachments going on than we do.
Repression of emotions is common in humans, and as is depression and anxiety. Are these common in other animals?
Well, depression, there are now experiments on depression. One is a fish experiment, which they did with zebrafish. You don't think of fish like this, I'm sure. But the zebrafish, they put them on ethanol in the water. And so the fish partied, so to speak, and then at some point they withdrew the alcohol. And the fish became very depressed. Zebrafish, usually they swim at the surface, but they were always sitting on the substrate and were not doing much anymore. And then they gave them Prozac or whatever medications that we use to be in a better mood, and they started swimming around again. And so basically these mechanisms of depression and stress are extremely ancient. They go back to the fish. And that's also why discussions about do fish feel pain, which is always the discussion that we have, are sort of nonsense, because most of the neural mechanisms that are involved in the emotions are extremely ancient. They're not even limited necessarily to the vertebrates.
That's making me think of, I keep going back to Jane Goodall, but who doesn't? That when old Flo was a famous chimpanzee, I think Flo was the first chimp to get an obituary, perhaps in the Times.
Yeah.
But when she was very old and she couldn't, old Raggedy or Flo, she had a son who was very dependent on her. Flint.
Yeah.
And after Flo died, my recollection is, maybe this is what you couldn't prove about depression because something else could have happened, but he stayed with her body and within a very short amount of time just wasted away and died without her. That seemed like depression.
It is possible. It's also possible that she had some sort of disease that Flint also had. So yeah, it's very hard to say in this particular case what happened there, because the death of Flint was so soon thereafter, and he was not dependent on her milk anymore or something. Right. He was much older than that. Yeah.
How do you define empathy?
So empathy, I think, has many layers. So I think it starts with sort of body-to-body connection, emotional contagion. You see someone who's happy, you're going to be happy. Actually, babies, human babies at the age of 10 days already, they cry when other babies cry. And they have tested that out. They cry more when they hear another baby cry than when they hear a vacuum cleaner or some other sound. It's specific to the crying. And girl babies do it more than boy babies, and so the sex difference in empathy is visible very early in life. So that's the sort of state matching, is usually how it's called, state matching or emotional contagion. That's the first level of empathy, which starts very early and which is found in all the mammals, I think. But then you get more complex layers. It's like, do you care about the other? Do you try to relieve the distress of somebody else, like consolation behavior? Or can you put yourself in the shoes of somebody else? Like, can you imagine the situation of somebody else? Which is much more complex and is not necessarily present at a very young age in humans. It's not necessarily present in all the mammals. So I think dolphins and elephants and apes, they can probably do that, but I'm not sure that many other species can do that. So there's many layers to empathy. And I usually call all of it empathy because I think they're all connected to each other. And then sympathy is a term that we usually use when that kind of empathy is translated into action. If sympathy has more to do with wanting to relieve the situation of somebody else. And so there's more action-oriented.
And about mirror neurons, about how people or other animals feeling something, or even sometimes going through the motions that they observe in another, when there's no cup there. Can you?
So mirror neurons were discovered in monkeys. People often forget that. They were not discovered in humans. And actually the evidence for mirror neurons is much better for monkeys because of the single cell recording that they can do in the monkeys. So mirror neurons, they react the same to your movement and somebody else's movement. So if I take this glass and bring it to my mouth, your mirror neurons for taking a glass would also be activated. So that's why they're called mirror neurons. And they probably relate to how you relate to the body and the movements and the intentions of somebody else. So they're often invoked when people talk about empathy. The story is very vague, I think. We're not convinced how these things work and how important they are, but it is important. If they are involved in human empathy, then they're probably also involved in monkey empathy, because that's where we discovered them.
How far across life do you, wait a minute, my neck. How far across life do you think emotions extend? Insects, plants, you're puffing up for this one.
Insects, I would not be surprised, because I think as soon as there are brains and insects, you can see emotional states, like the angry bee, so to speak. You can see emotional states, I think, in insects. Plants is really a puzzle for me. I don't understand plants, and I don't know much about how plants work. But it's, of course, a topic that is enormously coming up at the moment, the sentience of plants and what plants can feel or see. Certainly they have experiences, plants, in the sense that they notice changes in the environment and react to it. Whether they feel them, that's the problem of the feeling part. Feeling requires some level of consciousness, and I'm not sure that the plants have that. But certainly plants react to the environment, let's say it that way, and they try to survive. So the desire to stay alive is present in all living organisms.
Some of the, I don't know much about the, just recently a number of books have come out talking about just that, and plants that wait sometimes decades for their chance to reach the overstoried and come out in the... What chimpanzee questions do you hope to answer next?
Well, the question of feelings for me is very interesting. So I stay away from saying that I know the feelings of animals because I cannot really know them. But maybe one day with neuroscience we will be able to draw parallels and say, well, this is a neurological state of feeling this and feeling that, and maybe we can discover then in other species whether they have these states. So it would still be dependent on the self-report of humans, I suppose, to get to that point. But for me, that would be very interesting to know more about the consciousness and the feeling states of animals. But other than that, I think there's a lot of things we still need to discover. The apes, unfortunately, are very stressed and under threat in the wild, and so I'm not sure how long we will have them in the wild, and I hope we get a lot of answers before they disappear, or that maybe we can save them. That's a possibility, but we're very pessimistic at the moment about the situation.
This is something that interests me too, that as we see the wild spaces become more and more managed, what constitutes a wild animal, and how much of that wild behavior can they retain, and what will the planet look like? And I think that you believe that some of our captive populations of various animals are important, not just as a reservoir, but maybe even understanding that if we can maintain something of the wild, that we will be able to manage it.
The captive populations are especially important at the moment because you can get it to much more detail of behavior, you can do experiments, you can watch them more closely. But in the future, maybe they also, because that has already happened a few times, we can use the captive population to repopulate the wild. I hope we don't get to that point that that's necessary. But for example, orangutans, I don't know if you know that, but 100,000 orangutans have disappeared from Borneo in the last 20 years, which is half the population, meaning that if you're an orangutan, you're not really doing so well in the wild, and so there's a possibility that they disappear. And then the orangutans that we do have in captivity will be important.
And what happens to culture? Animals have culture, and they have perhaps an interaction, and their culture is formed by the cultures of the people around them. And so are we losing behaviors, culture? There's
the same problem as, let's say, with human languages, which are disappearing. The variety that we have of language is disappearing. And the same thing with chimpanzee behavior. There's all sorts of cultural variations, and some of them will be disappearing. So yes, some of the conservationists have made that point recently, is that there's an additional reason to preserving chimpanzees because they have a variety of cultures going on.
Should I be saying people's names as I am? All right, Laura. What advice would you give a young primatologist? We did have a scientist here, maybe.
What do you mean in terms of advice? What career you want to... Primatologists are usually very dedicated, and they take a lot of nonsense, and they take low wages, and if they work in the field, it's a very tough job to work in the field. But I would say in captivity, it's also a very tough job to work there. So many primatologists are very dedicated. They're very much in love with their subject. And so they're willing to take all these hurdles that we have. But there is still, I think, a possibility to influence the world and to exercise your profession. It's mostly now in, let's say, anthropology and psychology departments. It used to be, of course, in biology departments that you could do a lot of animal behavior, but the biologists have completely moved to molecular and macro and micro. But the biology departments may change also, because with the environmental crisis that we have, there's a lot of environmental science coming up, and so the old type of biology where you would classify plants and animals is actually making a little bit of a comeback. And so I would recommend to stay with those fields because that's where the future is of primatology, but primatology is very much under pressure at the moment.
Can you characterize the social meetings of primatologists as opposed to people who study other kinds of animals?
What do you mean? The social use of it?
No. I was thinking, I'm trying to think what I've heard in the circles about. Do you find them primatologists more competitive than, say, the guys who study big cats?
Oh, primatologists can be very competitive. Then you have a group of baboon people and they are killing each other. and even bonobo people, you know, you would think they would learn from the bonobos how to resolve these issues, but they don't. So yeah, primatologists can be very territorial. And that's true especially for field workers, because this is my field site, that's your field site. You don't visit me. For example, you mentioned Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall lived on Lake Tanganyika with Gombe Stream, but north from her is the Mahala Mountains, which is also a place where chimpanzees are being studied by the Japanese scientists. And Nishida, who worked there, and Jane Goodall, I don't think they've ever visited each other. Their students would take the boat, because it was not so hard to do, take the boat and visit each other's places and discover then these cultural differences that existed between the chimp populations. But field workers can be extremely territorial. Yeah.
I can remember I had read Jane Goodall throughout my youth, and later even finding out that there were other camps with people from other countries studying chimpanzees.
Yeah, and so when we got to the stage of the cultural differences, it was a captive chimp worker, Andy Whiten, who had no stake in all these territories. He had his own place in St. Andrews, who brought them together around the table to exchange information. And then they wrote this big paper, which was in 1999, I believe, where they compared all the chimpanzees in the field and all the habits that they had. So it was an outsider who had to do that. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on animal law groups pursuing personhood for chimpanzees?
Yeah, I don't know what to do with personhood and rights. That's not the sort of language that we scientists necessarily use, so that's lawyer language. I do feel we have an obligation to animals, and especially animals in our care. But that also applies not just to chimpanzees, that applies to all the agricultural animals, which is billions and billions of animals. So it applies to all animals. I think chimpanzees are, for me, obviously special, and I think for our species they should be special because they're our closest relatives. So I think and of course that has already happened. I don't know if you know, but 5 years ago the NIH decided that they were not going to support biomedical studies on chimpanzees anymore. So chimpanzees are basically not used anymore for biomedical invasive research in this country. I'm on the board of Chimp Haven. Chimp Haven is the facility where we have now 200 chimpanzees. We will have soon 300 chimpanzees, where we receive a lot of the ex-lab chimps and release them on big islands in Louisiana. So that's the situation with chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are being retired, basically, and people are also not breeding with these chimpanzees anymore. So at some point, captive chimpanzees in research settings will completely disappear, I think. But this may happen with other species as well. So it has happened with chimps. The other ape species have never been used in biomedical studies, but it may happen to other primates as well.
We have another legal question. Do widowed voles remarry?
I think if you give them the chance, maybe. I don't know what happens in the field. I don't know enough about the Prairie Voles to know what happens there. But I used to work as a student with jackdaws. Jackdaws are small corvids. So it's a bit half the size of a crow. They're a very social animal, and they're very much mated. The male and the female, they mate for life. And they always, if you see them in the cities in Europe, they're always flying in pairs. They're flying together, the male and the female, except maybe when the female is on eggs, but otherwise they're always together. And I've seen instances, I've experienced one instance in my own home, because I had a male and a female where the female disappeared at some point and the male died 2 weeks later. So he kept calling and he wasn't eating, and he died. But in the field I've also seen, because I studied the wild jackdaws, that one of the two disappears. Who knows what happened, maybe a predator or something. And then the other is extremely depressed, but at some point they will remarry, if that's what you call it. They will look for a new partner. So they do that kind of thing.
Crows are phenomenal, and I had the experience a while ago. I've interviewed over time the intelligence of crows is remarkable, and they recognize our faces, so they recognize individuals. And Kevin McGowan at Cornell had told me that he he was going into crow's nests to study them, just weighing the babies and doing something like that. But the crows hated him for his intrusiveness. And so he realized a long time ago they could recognize him because around the university, if he were just shopping on a Saturday, the crows would see him and be furious with him.
And they transmit that knowledge to each other also.
Yes, yes.
So that's why the experiments that they do on the crow face recognition, they do it with masks. So because
you're not marked for
so
the
they
rest
use
of your life.
masks like a Dick Cheney mask.
Yes.
It's true. Yeah. I think the students reacted to the mask also. But the crows certainly, they use masks because otherwise they keep being bugged by the birds.
I'm also intrigued that it works because animals know so much, and I wondered if that immobile mask really fooled them. But he started bringing peanuts, so when he was doing that sort of thing, he would just give some peanuts, and so they changed their mind about him. And after doing that interview, there were crows where I would walk my dog, and so I started to bring some peanuts, and I couldn't wait to tell him. I didn't talk to him for a very long time, and I said, it worked for me too. When I drive up to the park with my dog, the crows are like fighter pilots bringing Air Force One, and they go on either side of there wasn't traffic around there, and they would bring me right into my parking spot. They recognized me, and he said, standard. I think we're at the, are there any insights from animal emotions and morality that can help us in our current, we were talking about socio-political situation?
That's very diplomatic. Well, I think it's very unfortunate that we've gotten so polarized in this country that people don't even talk to each other, and they certainly don't vote for each other's proposals anymore. And so in Washington, it has become dysfunctional, the polarization. And I think the best way to solve that issue from a primate perspective would be to create gyms and lunch hours and to have them do things together, or maybe play soccer, I would say, as a European together, because it has gotten so polarized. And I think if people interact on a regular basis in situations that are non-political, or play games together or whatever, they would respect each other more and they would be getting closer. I've had that same discussion with hospitals because I did recently a study on the operating rooms in hospitals where we put an observer in the operating room to observe the behavior in the operating room. And there's too much conflict in operating rooms. You don't want to know that if you're a patient, but there are conflicts going on. And so again, I told the people in the hospital that they need to set up situations where these people who work together there meet each other also outside of that context and know each other a little bit better, because then they will be more respectful of each other. But the hospitals are not doing that, and I think Washington is not doing that. So I'm not sure they're listening to primatologists so much.
I think that may be it for questions. And maybe, I don't know if everyone's eager to get books signed. And
I can sign books, yeah, sure.
And let me just ask you also quickly, what is it that I know that you want to be the neutral observer, but this book seems like a passion project to me. And what is it that you hope comes out of the publication of this work?
Well, my goal is always to bring humans closer to animals than the other way around, to sort of to bridge the gap. So I feel we are animals and we don't always realize that. And of course, especially in the academy, outside the academy, people feel that their dog has emotions and all of this. But in the academy, we have tons of people who feel that humans are really special, and the philosophers and the anthropologists, they all write about how special we are. And I feel we need to better connect with nature and better connect with animals. And there's of course a bigger issue behind it, because our attitudes that we are something special and that we're not part of nature and that we are different has also brought us a lot of the ecological crisis that we have at the moment. The global warming and the species extinction is all a result of us thinking that we can do with nature whatever we want because we're not really part of it. We are something special and something separate. And I think that whole attitude of human dominance, basically, or human exceptionalism, has given us a lot of bad consequences. And so I'm fighting against that also, to some degree.
Thank you. If I'm to give an instruction, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I don't know what we do now.
There we go.
In the lobby, okay.
Beyond the